Welcome to the another edition of Uncensored. India and China are seemingly locked in a marital accord, where tensions are getting more pronounced, but it has not hit a point of divorce. India seemingly wants to keep the relation, but China wants it at its terms and conditions. Chinese actions have put India closer to the US, which itself is grappling with in how to deal with China. There seems to be strong gap between India's actions and statements. To talk all these issues, we are fortunate to have been joined by Jabin T. Jacob, who is an associate professor of international studies and governance rules at Shiv Nadar University. He is also the director of Center for Himalayan Studies. Jacob, thanks for giving your time.
Thank you, Tarun, for having me.
Okay, Jacob, let's start with this question. How do you see the India-China relations panning out? Why there's so much dissonance and gap?
I think the state of India-China relations was hugely affected by the incidents of the summer of 2020 at Galwan. There we saw an unprovoked attack by the Chinese on our troops. And of course, this had been building up for several weeks before that in a series of transgressions across the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. Uh, Now, ever since then, I think I would argue that there has been greater clarity in India's approach to China. We understand now that the Chinese say one thing, do another. They have violated all bilateral agreements between India and China. And they've sort of built up behind the LAC. They've sort of disregarded previous norms and agreements on the LAC. And since then, of course, India has not been able to take like for like actions on the LAC, but India has taken actions in other spheres, in the economic sphere, in the diplomatic realm, which have also gotten the Chinese worried. The Chinese are now particularly concerned about the growing closeness of India-US relations. And they seem to think that this is targeted against China. I think this is only, one. I mean, this actually gives you this sort of approach or this sort of attitude of the Chinese tells you a little more about how they view India. They do not view India as a country that is having agency of its own, but a country that does American bidding. So, in the Chinese worldview, it's really about US China conflict, and Indians are simply supporting the Americans. On our side, we have been very clear with the Chinese since 2020 that without the situation on the LAC being resolved, without troops pulling back from the LAC on both sides, there will be no normal in the relationship. The Chinese have trying, on the other hand, are trying to say that the situation on the LAC is now stable, and we should go back to what they call normalized border management. So it's basically both sides are talking different things on the LAC.
Exactly, that is the point I was coming to. I mean, there was a strong divergence of views between the meeting of NSS between of India and China. Our NSS said there's a strong uh, mutual disregard. I'm not pronouncing the exact what he said, but China seems to be saying that the situation is quite normal. Let's move it forward. So it seems that China doesn't want to restore the status quo ante, but that is a point of worry for India too. So how to deal with China in this regard?
So it is absolutely clear that the Chinese do not want to give up any of the advantages that they have gained since 2020. Two things happened. One, they seem to believe that they have checked the Indian military's growth or activities on the LAC by the actions of 2020, right? They seem to think that by their actions now they are drawing a lot more resources of the Indian Army onto the LAC, which might distract us from other concerns or other priorities. That's one. Second, the Chinese are also interested in building up on the LAC. This is a part of their borders that they had not previously given too much attention to. The traditional focus for the Chinese military has been the eastern and the southern parts of China, the coast or the borders of China. So in the east, because this is where the Americans are concentrated. This is where they feel the threat from the Americans, because the Americans are in alliance relationships with the Japanese and the Koreans, and of course the Taiwan issue. But under Xi Jinping, the emphasis has been an all-round development of the PLA, the Chinese military, and he, I think, has or is using the tensions with India also to build up Chinese military capacity in the West, in China's West, which is along the borders with India. And he's essentially indicating that the PLA should be ready for conflict at all times in all situations, and there is no situation in which it can keep its eye off any particular border. This sense of constant tension inside China, in terms of China's foreign relations, works to the advantage of an authoritarian system which feels under threat from its own internal instabilities. So, if you have external enemies, then it helps the country to come together more cohesively, because there's an external enemy to be faced or an external challenge to be faced. So, it's a very black and white world that the Communist Party of China is painting inside China. And so that is why we must actually disregard what the Chinese say when they say that things are stabilized or things are normal, because they've been saying this for a very long time. Even during the informal summits, if you recall, 2017 and 2018, they seemed to give us an impression that we had moved on from Doklam, but that's not exactly what happened. So no, they essentially were responding to Doklam in Galwan in 2020. So, and I don't think that response is entirely over. So we must stay on the alert. And even if they say things are normal, they are very likely to engage in other disruptions on the LAC. In fact, this is a new normal. The new normal is going to be one in which Indian and Chinese troops will now face off on the LAC in multiple sectors, not just the eastern sector. We saw what happened in Yangtze in December, in the eastern sector, but not just in the western sector in Ladakh. So this is likely to continue. We will, unfortunately, I think, see more clashes, more physical clashes, perhaps even more casualties. And I don't see an immediate improvement in ties, because that is the nature of the political system in China.
Jabin, there are two or three points which you have highlighted in this answer of yours. We will come to that. First, I would like to know from you. It is not for the first time that China has been gradually infringing in our land. It has been going on for quite a long time. I mean, if I recall from 2013 or 14, this has been going on gradually. But even after the Galway, they have been doing the same. If you recall the report by SP May Nitya, in which she have written that Indian response has not been as strong as was expected, and we are giving away land. And this has been going on for quite like, I mean, if you talk to any common people, grazers of Eastern Ladakh, they have been pointing it out. So why India? I mean, even the locals also allege that the army asked them to push back. This is what the locals say. So even after the Galwan, why India is not taking a stern action or a firm stand with regard to the Chinese infringement on our land?
So, well, first of all, I would not sort of characterize it as India giving away land. I think where and when we run into Chinese patrols, Chinese transgressions, we do push back, we do react. But the challenge, at least, has been in terms of the scale of pushback, in terms of what our troops are allowed to do. I think until now, the record has been that Indian troops have tried to stick to the bilateral agreements, follow the banner drills, follow the procedures, and therefore not initiate or engage in conflict. Now, this is something that the Chinese have taken advantage of. I've been on the record saying that a response to Galwan has to be like for like. If the Chinese think that they can violate agreements, and they think they can do this because they know that the Indians will never initiate something, and this is actually now becoming a sort of a millstone around our necks, the fact that Indians will never initiate anything, that Indians will only respond. And now, as long as we have the reputation, the initiative is in the other hands. in Chinese hands. So they can decide when they will do, where they will do something, and what they will do. Right? I think this has to change, and a response to a military transgression has to be military. While we did the right thing by banning Chinese apps, restricting Chinese FDI, but this is taking the issue away from the LAC. If there's something on the LAC, it has to be responded to at the LAC, and which will give, as you said, our grazers, the local populations, the border communities greater confidence. Now, clearly, the issue is, okay, what I mean, our foreign minister was on the record stating, do you want us to fight when the Chinese economy is 5 times bigger than the Indian economy? Now, to my mind, this is not a very good logic, because the Chinese have been willing to go toe to toe with the Americans, even though their economy is not as large as the American economy. So why is it that if the Chinese economy is bigger, the Chinese have an advantage, and if the Chinese economy is smaller, they still take the initiative? So I think in many ways we also need to see that it's just not a question of only the economy. On the LAC, the Chinese also face a lot of trouble and a lot of difficulties. And this fear that we seem to have that something we do on the LAC will immediately escalate across all of the LAC, I think that is a misplaced fear. It comes from a misunderstanding of China's political systems, political situation, and China's military capacities. So I think we need to be a little bolder, and we need to be a little more proactive in responding to Chinese transgressions. Because unless we can convince militarily the Chinese that we will not step back and that we are also capable of initiative, the Chinese will keep engaging in this. And then we will have problems internally where, reports such as the one that you mentioned come out saying that we have not responded adequately. And that is true. We have not responded adequately. And we have not responded adequately because we have decided not to respond adequately. We have decided that for the wrong reasons, because we misunderstand what the Chinese intentions are, what the Chinese capacities are, and what the Chinese motives are.
Exactly, that is the point I was coming to you. So, look, can you, for our viewers, uh, I mean, uh, take this point forward? Why there is so much misunderstanding, as you say, with regard to the Chinese capabilities on Indian side? I mean, they seem to be in a state of dilemma whether to act or not. They seem to be in a dilemma if Chinese economy is four or five times larger than us, whether we should react or not. But that logic doesn't seem to hold the ground. If you take the example in the history, I mean, then what happened in Afghanistan? What happened in Afghanistan? The American troops were so strong. Drawing an analogy, it may be quite different, but this is how the things work out on the ground. So even if the Chinese and there's a gap between Chinese and US economy, there's a tension also. There's a tension also, but China is not giving away. China is putting the shoe on the pedal all the time. So why there is no clarity in the Indian establishment? Why? What are their worries? I mean, that is a question which everybody wants to know. What are their worry points?
So I would say that there are two or three different reasons. One, for long we've ignored the study of China, uh, not just within the government but also outside the government. And next, we sort of adopted a position of, okay, only government knows best about China. So I mean, you cannot talk about China within the four walls of government without taking input from the outside. Now, all of this has improved gradually, but we need to have simply more investments in the study of China, both within government, in different agencies. I mean, the army, Navy, Air Force, they're all sort of developing interest and capacities on China. But it's not just the three armed forces, but also the paramilitary forces, like the ITBP, for example. ITBP faces China on the border. Now, what are the capacities within the ITBP in terms of, say, Chinese language, Tibetan language, intelligence collection, and so on? So those are the capacities that are completely lacking. So those need to be built up. Now, all of these will take time. So, and we are seeing some positive changes towards building up these capacities. But at the same time, you also need input from outside of government. We need to invest more in our universities, in our Chinese language training. We need to scale up uh, our think tanks provide greater support. Unfortunately, in this sphere, we are taking a shortcut of sort of relying very heavily on the Americans. It's almost as if there is a disregard for Indian scholars working on China and thinking that only output from elsewhere, America will is to be privileged or is much more reliable. Whereas the Americans have gotten China wrong, right? I mean, for 40 years, they thought that they could engage and reform or socialize China into the global system, and it's not happened. Whereas in India, we can understand China a little more, a lot better than the Americans, because in many ways our conditions, our development conditions, our human resources, etc., are somewhat similar. The political systems are different, but we are neighbors. We've been dealing with them for so long. I think we should have greater confidence in our capacities or capabilities to understand the Chinese. Uh, unless we invest in learning China and in generating discussion and debate on China, and in a sense generating competition between think tanks, universities, different service institutions in the study and analysis of China, we are not going to go anywhere. So it is and because we don't know, there is a lack of confidence in dealing with China. And let me also add that traditionally we've been all been very comfortable dealing with the familiar problem of Pakistan. All right, so it has taken some time, and I would not say that the transition is complete, but it's taking time to move completely from viewing China as, viewing Pakistan as a primary threat to viewing China as a primary challenge, right? So unless we get rid of our obsession with Pakistan, we will not be able to focus 100% on China. And really, that is, I think, even the man on the street, using common sense, now begins to understand that China is our real most important concern.
Exactly. That is the point you have raised, very important, that we have to understand our main threat is from China, not from Pakistan. Pakistan, we have focused quite heavily on Pakistan. I was just recalling an article. There was an anniversary issue of India Today in 2015 or 2014. There was a piece, Girilal Jain, the legendary editor of Times of India, if you recall, Girilal Jain, he had written that once he was traveling by air, so another Chinese person was sitting with him. That was in early 70s, or if early 70s, late 70s or early 80s. So he talked to him and said, "What are you doing in India?" He said, "Okay, we are studying the Indian culture and all those things." So he said, "How many guys of you are in India?" He said, "We have got about 400 people who are studying the Indian culture." So that shows how their long viewpoint of strategic interest is. This is what was lacking quite now. This is lacking what not then. India didn't even anticipate how the Chinese work. Now we're a bit of clarity is coming. So, but what more should be done? What more should be? But if you say the Indian response has been quite muted, they are giving an impression that we are on control of the things along the LOC, which is factually not correct. So unless and until you give a clear picture to the general public what is happening on the ground, a pushback from the people will not come. The Indian authorities, I feel, are muting the things, are also muting the discourse. So how to change, how to bring about a radical change in this direction?
So I would say that, at least as far as the armed forces are concerned, the security establishment is concerned, I think many lessons have been learned from Galwan, and some of the lacuna, etc., are being fixed. Having said that, obviously lot more can be done. Things could be much better. Things could move much faster. I mean, take simple things like, look, it's not sometimes not only about China. Take things like theaterization, joint commands in India. This is moving too slowly, and this is, you can't blame the Chinese for it. We can't blame the Americans for it. This is our problem. This is something that we have not done, or we have not moved fast because of our own internal issues. So the thing is that when a challenge appears on the security horizon, then at least we should be able to move things quickly. Similarly, the example of number of Chinese studying Indian culture, Indian languages. For the longest time, we were reliant only on a 25 people India-China exchange scholarship to send Indians to China. That's all the Indians that ever went to China, right? But more Indians started going to China because the Chinese themselves started offering scholarships, right? So many Indians took the initiative on their own to go and study in China, uh, depending on Chinese government scholarships. Now, this is an unacceptable situation. Why is it that the Indian government doesn't spend more in investing and in now? Now, unfortunately, it's too late because now we are closing our, links to China, and I think in this particular case, maybe it is the right thing to do because it is not safe or appropriate in many ways to send for the Indian government to send its people there. But we still have the option of relying on Taiwan or relying on Japan or Vietnam. All of these countries, or Korea, all of these countries have Chinese studies programs, which our people need to be sort of be part of and make use of. Take the simple case of the number of journalists. I mean, recently we had this case in which both sides have expelled journalists completely. But even so, India only had 3 or 4 journalists in China at any given point in time, right? Whereas Chinese had 10, 14, 10, 15, in their Xinhua, their official state media. So even there, they were able to put in money and invest in a lot of our, and they learned multiple languages, Hindi, Tamil, Bengali. They could speak multiple Indian languages and come here. And now what are the Chinese doing? They're doing it in our neighborhood. They are in Bangladesh, they're in Pakistan, they're in Sri Lanka, speaking Bengali, Urdu, Pashto, Sinhala, Tamil. Now, even we don't have journalists speaking all those languages in these countries, right? So, while we are concerned about China, we should also see what is the capacity on our immediate neighborhood. So I think China in this way should help us understand a lot of our own limitations. And I think there is now a greater sense of those limitations. But how we respond to it, how we resolve it is up to us. We have to put in the investments. And I don't think there is a shortage of money or investments. I also want to come back to this point that you talked about. Accountability is important. You're right. If the government does not make clear its policies, its rationale for engagement or disengagement, doesn't engage with the public more, then we are not going to have sustained attention on China. We'll only have episodic attention. Something happens on the border, then everybody's concerned about China. But what we need is sustained, regular attention on China, not just at the elite level, intellectual, business, political, but also at the ordinary level of ordinary people. Unless our ordinary people believe India's foreign policy is important for their own lives, we are not going to be a great power. Forget being a regional power.
Exactly. No, Jabin, let's move it forward in the coming to the end of our program. Now, we are moving closer to the US. I mean, with regard to the Modi visit, how he was giving a grand welcome and so many deals were signed, and which were, I mean, quite a, if I would say, a linear progression of what the previous government have been doing. These are fructifying now. But US too has got its own interest with regard to the China, and that is one of the reason it is giving more leverage or more grandstanding to the Modi also. So can US be our relied partner? And in your article, you have also quoted actually tells that India is a wrong bet because India cannot play a second fiddle. So how does India fit into these two things? It cannot be a second partner. It cannot play a second fiddle to US. It cannot be its ally. It can be its partner, but cannot be its ally. And how much then in this paradigm we can rely on US to deal with China?
I think we have the opportunity to make use of what the US is offering us. But we walk into the relationship with our eyes wide open. There are certain advantages, technological development, economic, all of these advantages the US does bring to the table, and we should make the most of it. But at the same time, I think we can make it clear to the Americans, and the Americans are also beginning to understand this, that we have our own views and we have our own pace of dealing with international issues, and we might have different positions, such as, say, on climate change or on Russia from the Americans. And if the sooner the Americans accept it, it is the better it is for the partnership. I don't think we should let the Americans forget that the relationship performed suboptimally. The India-US bilateral relationship performed suboptimally entirely because of America's own positions during the Cold War, right? Um, but this relationship has sort of moved ahead a lot. Uh, the US is, of course, wanting to get close to India, maybe primarily because of the China factor, but we have our own reasons to get close to the United States. And China need not necessarily drive all of it. But yes, we have to be a little careful in terms of how we deal or engage with the Americans, say, in the defense sector, in the technology sector, because we do not want to undercut or undermine our own domestic industry or strengths in the partnership with the Americans, right? It has to be a relationship of equals. It has to be a relationship where the Americans transfer technology, build up capacity in India, because it is good for them as well, not just for us, right? And they did a lot more in China for a lot less. So I think a lot less in return. And India, they should realize, and I think they will realize, that the Indian relationship is a far more equal and a fair exchange. We do not discriminate against American companies like the Chinese did. We do not, arrest or imprison foreign nationals like the Chinese do, as a way of hostage diplomacy, right? So in many ways, we are a far, far more responsible international player than the Chinese. And if the Americans are unwilling to or unable to see this, then the loss is entirely theirs. We are going to be a pole in international relations with or without the United States, whether or not the Chinese or Americans like it. And it's up to the Americans to decide whether they want to be in partnership with us, or they want to sort of keep a distance from us. I think it is best for both US and India to cooperate in order to get the Chinese to desist from bad behavior, to become a more responsible stakeholder in the international system. For that, it is better India and US work together. But even if the US were not to work together with the Indians, I think we will develop a capacity eventually to ensure that both the US and the Chinese will behave in the international system.
Jagman, last question is, there are two or three points which you highlighted in this answer. First, uh, we are telling the Americans, and Americans have to also accept it. We have to be an equal partner. There cannot be no partner can play, especially the India cannot play a part of second fiddle. So we have to be an equal partner. We have to build our own capabilities and capacities also. We have to be more clear with our understanding of China also. Given all these things, your last take on how can India tell China also that we can be a good neighbor, but neighbor on equal terms. A neighbor with no one will dictate the terms. And how the China will respond, because if you go by the history of Xi Jinping, he's quite autocratic. He's quite autocratic, and some people are saying he's outreaching also. And there may be some tipping point coming. Not sooner, but later, a tipping point may come. So how can India tell China categorically on these terms? We are good, we are neighbors, but we are also equal partners, and don't infringe on our territory, and be a reasonable player, because but expecting reasonableness from the China, especially from this regime, seems to be a quite hypothetical word I'm using. So your last takes.
So, I think, my answer might seem counterintuitive to some. Like I said at the beginning, when the Chinese transgress on the LAC, the response on the Indian side needs to be military. It has to be punitive. It cannot be in the realm of the diplomatic statements, or it cannot be on the realm of the diplomatic statements, or just in the economic realm. It has to be punitive, right? So it is only then, when the Chinese know that an aggressive response will meet an aggressive response, will they learn to look at India differently. This needs to be very, very clear as far as the Indian side is concerned. Second, we also need to be able to understand that the Chinese have interests in our neighborhood. So economic interests, They might call it the BRI. We don't need to necessarily accept that term, etc. But we need to be able to make use of Chinese investments. If the Chinese, I mean, our smaller neighbors are going to want Chinese investment, right? They are going to make use of Chinese investment if we are not going to be able to fill that gap. So either we replace, or we have the capacity to replace and compete with the Chinese on the economic front, or we find a way in which we are able to make the most of it for our own connectivity initiatives with our neighborhood. So this needs to go. Third, I think, you know, it cannot be that we do things in sequence. We have to do multiple things now in order to deal with China. And it cannot be that, oh, our primary concern is South Asia, therefore we'll ignore Africa. We do not have that luxury anymore. We need to deal with Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Latin America. So we need to build capacity, languages, intellectual, academic, media. So, we need to start thinking big. Look at the Chinese media's reach across the world. The way they sell their narratives, even on India now, to in Spanish or in French, in Africa, in Latin America. This we also need to be able to counter and deal with. So, I mean, if we do these three things, I think we'll be well in a position to deal with the China challenge.
Jabin, what you have said is that if India really wants to wish guru, the template is in China. You have to understand how the Chinese work and emerge as a wish guru, quote unquote. So we don't have a luxury of time also. Chinese are playing at a multiple level. We do have to play at a multiple level. And also our response has to be more strong militarily, especially on the ground. Unless that happens, things will not change radically as people expect. So, Jabin, thanks a lot for sparing your time, giving up your perspective on the Indo-China relation and what are the dangers China posing to us. Thanks a lot. We will come back to you once again for more understanding on this issue. Thanks for sparing your time. Sir.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this, and I hope your readers, your viewers enjoy this as much. Thank you. Bye bye.